You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Yeah.
Okay, brothers, I'm all ready to go. Christian, take it away.
All right, brothers, good evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker is someone that I've been wanting to hear speak for a long time, and we finally got him to come here to Cornerstone. He is the author of 15 books, and he's going to actually have his 16th book published, I think, in about a week or so. Some of his books include Building Better Builder series, The Craft Unmasked, and also Brother Asks, Volume 1, Uncommon Discourses About Hiram. Brother Nagy is the recipient of the 2014 Dwayne E. Anderson Award for Excellence in Masonic Education. He is a national and international speaker on Masonic topics in education. And tonight he is going to present us the topic of building better builders, one mason at a time, filling the entered apprentice toolbox. Please join me in welcoming Brother John Nagy.
Thank you, brothers. Thank you very much. If you can go ahead and mute the microphone on that end, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you very much, Brother Christian. Brothers, before I start in with this presentation and get into what I call my presentation voice, I want you to know that this particular presentation has been knocking the socks off of brothers worldwide. It all started with me asking a simple question: why are the compasses not included in the 6 working tools in the Preston web-based rituals that are used throughout the entire United States? And I got to thinking, I wonder how many other tools are mentioned within the ritual that are not brought up in the ritual as working tools. So what you're about to see is my going down a rabbit hole with a simple question: how many working tools are actually shown to candidates coming through just at the entered apprentice level? And I will tell you, brothers, the rabbit chase that I was on opened the doors to things that just blew me away. I will tell you that entered apprentices who see this particular presentation are extremely grateful because it helps make sense out of what it is that they went through. However, I will tell you, the Master Masons who get exposed to this particular lecture, their mouths drop open, and a lot of them admit, I have never realized how many working tools are shown just at the entered apprentice level. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. So buckle up and brace yourselves for some really fantastic light. Welcome to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders Uncommon Masonic Education Workshop. I'm your coach host, John Nagy. I will be sharing some information tonight that have been conveyed in one form or another since 2009 when I published my first Masonic book. It represents maybe about 50 to 55 minutes of a typical 6.5-hour Building Better Builders workshop that I do locally and around the country when invited to come and speak. It is intended to convey light to the front-end workers, those mentors, coaches, trainers, and instructors that are guiding our next generation toward betterment. And with that in mind, if you're sitting in this workshop, you're being trained as a trainer, a coach, mentor, and instructor into what it is that you can share with this next generation right out the chute. So with that being said, of course, if you're interested in any of the material that I'm sharing with you tonight, I have a few books that I did write over the last few years. And this particular presentation comes out of building Boaz, and believe it or not, building Hiram also, the Craft Perfected, and the new one that I'll be publishing within 2 weeks, the Craft Mastered, Completing the Temple, the Fellow Craft Dream. This is a compilation of the tools that you'd be working with or developing if you actually did the work that is pointed toward by the apprentice degree. And I call it filling the apprentice's toolbox. I will warn you ahead of time, none of what it is that I'm about to share is required. However, if you ask yourself immediately, well, if it's not required, why bother? If you remember that you are going to help aid and assist your brothers along the path, and if you want them to better understand what it is that that path entails, part of it is memorization and information retention. However, what I'm about to share not only helps you memorize things and help you retain the information that you have to remember, it'll also, in the end, help you with membership retention. And I believe that when we get done with the presentation today, you'll see how all three of these key together to bring about exactly what it is that I just indicated. The apprentices have one goal, and that is transformation. They are transforming their heart from chaos to order, and their sole job is to bring order to the chaos of their hearts. The results of this work is personal mastery and self-discipline of the heart and of their emotions. They're literally moving from a rough ashlar. Brace yourselves, brothers, because this is the first Easter egg that you're going to see, to a common ashlar. And from a common ashlar to a perfect ashlar. Now you're saying, hey, ritual only points to rough and perfect. I don't hear anything in ritual about the common ashlar. Well, this is an operative term, and it is a term that is specific to an ashlar that was rough, but is being worked. And the moment that you take tool to a rough ashlar, it's no longer a rough ashlar. It is then called a common ashlar until the work is complete and it is got exactly the work that needs to be done, and it was suitable for the builder's use, aka perfect for what it is that the builder had intended for it. The very first tool that you will literally be embraced by is the cable toe. The cable toe is a working tool, and it is both a separator and a limiter. What it does is it separates out the obligations that you have outside the craft from the craft activities that you have inside the craft. And by its use, you will automatically understand by internalizing this tool, which you are supposed to be doing during the obligation. You will be able to internalize the difference between the outside activity obligations with the inside activities of the craft, with the outside taking precedent or priority over the inside of lodge and craft activities. What this tool does when properly internalized and embraced and perfected is that it empowers you, it enables you, and tugs at you to say no appropriately to anything that will interfere with your outside activities. And when you are at the altar and you are released from this cable toe, because you're now bound by the strong cord of a moral obligation, that moral obligation includes the cable toe. So not only are you supposed to keep in mind all that the cable toe represents, but you're supposed to have in unity with that the obligations that you're taking at the altar, with the understanding that the cable toe takes precedent. By the way, for those of you who wondered what the lost word is, sometimes it's no. The apprentice work has 7 different categories. An apprentice must set their plumb. They must do moral investigation to set standards for themselves and circumscribe and subdue to set boundaries for others. They must do emotional management. They must divest themselves of vices and superfluities and invest themselves in virtue. And finally, they must be able to master time management. Let's go into some of these. How do you set your plumb? That's a great question to ask. The moment that you enter into the lodge, you set your plumb by putting your hand upon the Bible and taking an obligation. But before we set the plumb, there's another working tool that you're introduced to. This is called the point within a circle flanked by 2 perpendicular parallel lines. You might see this on any one particular lodge wall with a Bible set on top, and you were probably told about it during your entered apprentice degree. The point within a circle is flanked by the Holy Saints John. However, I will tell you the rest of the story now. I call this the Flanked Circumpunct, and the reason behind that is it's 3 words versus 11. So I may mention the 11 later on when appropriate, but up until then, I'm going to use the term the Flanked Circumpunct. Your first experience of the Flanked Circumpunct is when you came through the inner door, pointed by the arrow and the dot. We're going to play through this. And your brothers were on both the north and south side, sitting down at first, creating 2 perpendicular parallel lines. And you entered. You didn't know it at the time, but you had a object in the center of the lodge called the altar, which was surrounded by 3 lesser lights and was carrying 3 greater lights. And what you did was you circumambulated that altar. And when you got all the way back to the east, you were told to go west, young man, and then approach in proper and due form. And you did. And when you got to the center, you became the point within the circle that you just created. You just circumscribed a circle around the altar, and you're now the point within that circle. And at that particular juncture, you were asked to put your hand on the Bible and take an obligation. And your brothers stepped down and flanked you. And they were standing up perpendicular, and they were forming 2 parallel lines. This is where the point within a circle flanked by 2 perpendicular parallel lines came into being. And it is a symbol for obligation. And you will use this working tool. You will use this working tool first upon yourself 3 times, and then you will use it as an individual who represents the point within a circle flanked by 2 perpendicular parallel lines. By the way, I was telling you before about setting your plumb by taking upon yourself a moral obligation. That Bible that you took the oath on, that should be a perfect representation of what you have etched within your heart. So when you ask a candidate what book represents the moral code that they want to be held accountable to, it better be the one that's on the altar when they take the obligation, because it is supposed to be symbolic of what's etched in their heart. And that's where you set your plumb. You hang your plumb on the moral code that you take your obligation. So we set our plumb. And when we set our plumb on the Holy Writ, we now have several working tools that we've already discussed. We have the cable toe, we have the Holy Bible, we have the plumb, and we have the point within a circle flanked by 2 perpendicular parallel lines, aka the flanked circumpunct. So there's 4 so far. The standards that we hold ourselves accountable to are what are written within our hearts, and they should be represented symbolically by the Bible. This is a working tool, if I must stress, and you can actually mix it up. Instead of a flanked circumpunct, you now have a divided circumpunct. And this perfectly illustrates what apprentices need to be dealing with specific issues. The morality, in contrast to the emotions that drive them all over the place, virtues versus vices and superfluities. And of course, you set your plumb on that holy writ because your morality ought to be guiding your emotional choices. And if you use the divided circumpunct and rotate it 45 degrees, you now have a checklist that is very reminiscent of that which was used by Brother Franklin. And what this does is allow you to do a reality check. What it is that you profess versus what you do. They should match up. And if they don't match up, you have integrity issues. What you do versus what you don't do tells you what's important versus what is unimportant. And as you move through this, you wind up doing a moral investigation, what your morals are based on your behavior versus what you say, match them up. If they don't match, you got integrity issues. It tells you what you value, and it also tells you what's important. And as a result of doing moral investigation based on the plumb that you set on the Holy Writ, what you say versus what you do, it basically tells you right off the bat if you're being true to your word. So we have standards that we set up. Now, when you put your hand on the three great lights, one of those three great lights was the compass. And in the Apprentice Work, we are told to use the compasses to circumscribe and subdue. And that makes it a working tool. And although it's dedicated to the craft, it's told that we're supposed to circumscribe and subdue our passions and desires appropriately, keep them within due bounds. So what happens here is we are introduced to a working tool in a very, very indirect way, but it is described as to what we are supposed to do with it. So you're supposed to use these compasses to circumscribe and subdue, and as you circumscribe and subdue, you establish boundaries around your standards. Now, standards are those personal limits to which we hold our individual selves accountable to. Boundaries, though, are social limits. Those are those limits to which we hold ourselves accountable to when it has to do with others and how we hold others accountable to when it comes to us. The key word here is both involve limits. And as human beings, it tells us that these are our windows of operation. As a human being, you have 5 windows of operation. You have a physical window of operation. You have an emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and temporal window of operation. All 5 are uniquely what make us human. Back to the standards. You set your standards. You have boundaries circumscribing around those standards, and those boundaries are intimately tied with passions and desires. Now, interestingly enough, you'll notice that as we're circumscribing and subduing, we have created for ourselves a level. And that is the first part of the level that's created. The interesting thing about the level is there takes a multitude of other tool use and development in order for the level to be created fully. And you'll see us building the level as we go through use of the other tools and development of the other tools. This internalizes an understanding that when it comes to other, we have to circumscribe and subdue, keep things within due bounds, and we have to start understanding that there has to be equity when it involves others. So we're starting the premise of understanding how the level applies to our lives. Now we'll go back to that issues, and we're going to be talking about those passions and desires, aka emotions. Oh no. But we're going to be talking about emotions in a really simplistic way. Desires are what we are very comforted by. We pursue them because we're comforted by them. However, passions are things that we are uncomfortable with and discomforted by. And as we look at various aspects of our emotions, you'll see immediately that emotions will tell you whether you think something is worthy or unworthy. And you could always see the attitude of an individual by how they react to what is before them. They'll either believe it's worthwhile or not worthwhile, and their emotions will tell you immediately. But let's go back to those comforts. Desires are those things that we want, we pursue, and we seek them. Passions are a little bit different creature. We're not comforted by them. However, passions are those things that we will willingly suffer to get. We will seek them out. Whereas desires, we may like something and may seek it, but we're really not motivated highly to pursue them. But things that we are passionate about, we will gnaw our way through a brick wall for a bucket of water if we wanted it. We are willingly suffering to get our ends met. So emotions, we're supposed to subdue them. Subduing does not mean killing them, stuffing them. It means directing your emotions in a mature manner toward mature, civil, respectful, considerate, beneficial, and intended ends. Once again, there is absolutely no suppression, oppression, negation, or killing of emotions when it comes to subduing. You validate them and you direct them accordingly in a mature way. And that's part of the process of growing up, is you have your emotions and you know how to direct them appropriately. Passions, no one should ever suffer for what you want. And this is one of the reasons why we circumscribe them. I love this aspect of Freemasonry because it's basically telling you, you can be as passionate as you want. Just make sure that nobody suffers for what it is that you want. So if I have something that I passionately want, I should not impose upon anyone else, a brother, a family member, a spouse, a kid, neighbor, coworker, makes no difference. We are to circumscribe and subdue and make sure that our passions are our own. So once again, we have passions and desires set by our standards and kept within due bounds. This common gavel is one of the working tools that an apprentice is actually shown. And what they're not told is it's actually a twofold tool. There are two things that a common gavel is used for. Now, you're probably saying, no, you're just supposed to use it to divest our vices and superfluities. But no, that's only one. That's the divestment. But there's another use for this tool, and it has to do with investment. I'll explain myself. The divestiture has to do with two things. They have to do with vices, and they have to do with superfluities. And superfluities are defined as unnecessary excess. And I like to drive home the point and say unnecessary excess. Maybe that's superfluous, but I hope it's driven the point enough for you to recognize I'm serious about the definition. Vices are a not so different beast. In fact, it's actually the same beast. It's harmful, unnecessary excess. In fact, when it comes to vices and superfluities, both of them are categorized as unnecessary excess, with vices taking the lead as a harmful superfluity. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. This is a Venn diagram. Vices are a subset of superfluities. And how it differs from normal superfluities is vices are those superfluities that are harmful. Give you an example of what that looks like with food. One plate or one serving, that's refreshment. 2 servings, however, is now getting into superfluities. And 3 or more, you're now getting into vice because it's actually causing stress on your body that's undue and unnecessary, to the point where your immune system and a few other things are going to go out of whack because you have overdone it. So we're supposed to be divesting vices and superfluities with this common gavel. And how do we do this? Well, I'm going to throw in an agricultural term called threshing and winnowing. To thresh is to break apart wheat from chaff, whereas winnowing is to actually remove or divest the chaff from the wheat. Now, how do we apply this? when you are looking at your vices and superfluities, what you want to do is create a list so you know what it is that you're supposed to be targeting. And then you start removing it. You create a plan, and this is basically how you're going to remove it. When you're chipping away at your ashlar, this is the equivalent of chipping away, but all the chips are surrounding your ashlar. It's the winnowing, the divesting, where you're taking those chips, literally removing them from the area so they can never come back. That's what I mean by divest. You cannot just chip away, because as you're chipping away, you still have them around. You have to find a way of removing them from your life so that they are no longer present. So how do you target? That's where virtue comes in. This is the investment aspect of the common gavel. You have 7 different virtues that are discussed in the entered apprentice degree. And virtue literally means strength or manly strength. Another way of saying that is Boaz. Literally, when you are taking your common gavel and whacking away at that ashlar, what's happening is with every stroke of your common gavel, you are investing a virtue. In fact, it is absolutely impossible to get rid of a vice or a superfluity without using a virtue to do so. So the common gavel literally represents the investiture of virtue. And the virtues are cardinal and theological in nature, in the entered apprentice degree. Incidentally, you've got 4 and 3. So what I've done is created a memory device that I'm hoping will be a jaw dropper once I show you how to put this together. You've got the cardinal and theological virtues, and when you put them together, the entered apprentice is to build a house of virtue. And that beautiful rendering of the apron, the way that they wear it, is a beautiful reminder of the house that they are responsible for building, using that common gavel to build the virtues that they have to build by chipping away at their ashlar. And this also denotes a foundation of strength, and that foundation of strength is what it is that an entered apprentice has to build in order for them to participate in the next construction down the line. So let's take a look at the square of virtue. When you have your hands on the 3 great lights, one of the working tools is the square. And in an entered apprentice configuration, and it reminds the entered apprentice that they are to build a square of virtue. And by that square of virtue, they are to square their actions, which makes it a working tool. So a pop quiz. What's the divestment tool? It's the common gavel. What is the investment of work that you use the common gavel? A conscious and deliberate virtue building Boaz, or manly strength. So what's really interesting is now that we've built all these virtues, and we're going to go back to that level that we started hinting at when we talked about circumscribing and subduing using the circumscribe Plumb. By internalizing all these virtues, you have a foundation of theological virtues that is the premise of your level activity. Faith, hope, and charity or love is your base. Fortitude and prudence hold up the pendulum, and the pendulum swings back and forth for you to exercise justice and temperance appropriately when it comes to yourself, when you're dealing with others. So you're building more onto your level and internalizing your level. The level cannot work without virtue. This is what I'm trying to communicate to you. Now we've got another working tool that is actually mentioned by the worshipful master during the working tools lecture. And we're told it's a 24-inch gauge, and the 24-inch gauge is 24 equal parts, where we're supposed to divide them into 3 equal parts having to do with work, service, and rest. Now, I don't know about you, but I have gotten a lot of brothers coming to me very depressed trying to work this 888 activity out with work, service, and rest. And the first thing out of my mouth when I say this, talk about the time management aspect of this, is sometimes, my brother, numbers do not denote quantity, they denote quality. And I usually get a blank stare saying, good God, coach, what are you talking about? The 888 was never to be taken as an actual quantity. It was supposed to denote quality. You are to put in whatever time is necessary in any one of these particular categories in such a way that the time that you put into one category doesn't detrimentally impact the other categories. In other words, this is a balancing act, making sure that you have quality in each one of these categories, or the best quality you can possibly have. This is a balancing act. And time management is not about the equity of the numbers. It's about the balance of the categories, making sure that you take care of each category as if it were precious and as if it was not going to be impacted negatively by the other two. The keys to time management, brothers, you got to be real honest about where you're putting your time, and you got to be aware of what you're using your time. So sometimes a time management worksheet, keeping track of your time, is necessary up front so that you can be not only honest with what you're doing, you have it written out so that you can take a look at how much time you're actually wasting. There's no way that you're going to do any time management unless you have priorities. And how you set your priorities is when you set your Plumb. That tells you what's important versus what's not important, and you set your priorities accordingly. So in this respect, the 24-inch gauge will not have any success in its use if you didn't set your Plumb originally. And of course, balance is another key to time management. You must keep track and schedule it. This is all about knowing how long it's going to take to complete a job, the deadlines, and when to start in order to make sure that you end in enough time to review your work before it's submitted. All things that have to do with time management. And I think you will agree when you take a look at all that I have just put on this one slide. There's no way that you're going to be able to do any of this if you haven't developed and internalized the previous working tools that were mentioned already. I've mentioned 9 so far. The apprentice tools, I'll go through them with you. You got the cable toe, you got the flanked circumpunct, you've got the Holy Bible, which is our ruling guide. You've got your Plumb. You have also the circumscription that occurs by your physically circumscribing the altar and then taking the compasses that are shown to you to circumscribe your passions and keeping your desires within due bounds. Then what you have also is the common gavel, which helps you build the square of virtue, which also helps you create and strengthen your level. And last but not least, your 24-inch gauge, which you're not going to know how to use until you've actually developed all these other tools and internalized every one of them, because you're not going to be able to do time management without your priorities set, your boundaries established, and what have you, your standards. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to mention one more working tool. Actually, it's a pair. What you have here is the rough and smooth ashlar, but you also have something called a trestle board and the pencil that goes with it. They're a pair. They're working tools 10 and 11. And the trestle board is a very interesting tool. We are told that with the trestle board, we are to endeavor to erect a spiritual building agreeable to the rules and design laid out by God himself. And at an entered apprentice level, we're talking about foundation only. That is their focus. And it has to do with values, morality, integrity, standards and boundaries, vices and superfluities, vices, emotional and time management, and all the tools that you have to work with in order for those foundations to be internalized and established to strengthen the foundation by which you will eventually build upon. The firm foundation starts with you getting rid of vices and superfluities. Then you work on the different facets that an entered apprentice is required to work on in order for them to move from childhood or youth to manhood or adulthood. They build that foundation using 11 tools in order to bring that about. The transformation that you can expect by doing the work of the Enter Apprentice degree, not the proficiencies that Grand Lodges ask you to do, but the actual work that the ritual points you toward, it is assumed that you come in weak and burdened. You're burdened by vices and superfluities, and weak because you have not yet strengthened the virtues within. And by doing the work, you cross a bourne. You cross from being weak to strengthened. There's your virtues, and from burden to unburdened. Your vices and superfluities are gone. And this work will irreversibly pick you up and transport you, transforming you irreversibly, and finally putting you down as the man that you need to be. And that's your first raising. The checklist that an entered apprentice would be going through would have to do with values, morality, integrity, standards and boundaries, divestiture, investiture, emotional, and time management. What is the goal of an entered apprentice? The apprenticeship is to develop personal mastery of the emotions in the heart, to develop self-discipline, to transform the heart from chaos to order, or to bring order to the chaos of the heart, to create a strong foundation, to build that spiritual building upon that is talked about in the trestle board. Again, the trestle board that we're supposed to be using to gather information of God's design and rules are the greatest books of nature and revelation. Again, a foreshadowing. This is future work that the entered apprentice, once they've gone through the entered apprentice work, is supposed to be engaging in, creating for themselves an understanding of the greatest books of nature and revelation. And I will tell you, there's only one path that will empower a candidate to understand what God has written in the greatest books of nature and revelation, and that is revealed in the Fellowcraft degree. The trestle board tells you about the formation of a foundation. With all the working tools involved, you create that foundation to build that spiritual building talked about in the trestle board lecture. And of course, here's my segue. If you're interested in hearing about that wonderful bridge between the entered apprentice and Fellowcraft degrees, I can tell you that I have another 40-minute presentation that I would be absolutely delighted to share with you that continues the trend of the trestle board. The title of it is the EA and Fellowcraft Degree Bridge, and I would be honored to come back some future time to share that light with you. So this is what you want to share with the entered apprentices when they ask you about what tools they need to be working on and developing. If they actually did the work, what the ritual points to, these are the tools that they would be developing. So what I'm going to do at this particular point is I'm going to start winding down the presentation. I'm going to open it up for Q&A very shortly. I'm going to ask you what your takeaways, your aha moments, your eurekas, any future changes that you might anticipate as a consequence of the light that I shared with you here today, along with impacts that you see this information might present to you, along with any questions and thoughts that you might want to share with the group as we wind down and get into the Q&A. Let me go ahead and close up. This was all based on building Hiram, building Boaz, the craft perfected, and the craft mastered, which the last one will be coming out real soon. You can get this last one, actually pre-order it at coach.net/TCM, capital TCM.htm. And I'd be more than happy to make sure that that information gets to you if there is an interest in this last book. I've got an entire chapter just on this particular presentation. Once again, I've got a few books that I've written. If you're interested, some of them are there. I thank you, my brothers. This has been a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders Uncommon Masonic Education Workshop. I have been your presenter, John S. Nagy. You can find me at Facebook, Coach.net, along with my blog, buildinghiram.blogspot.com. And yes, I even have a YouTube channel that has about maybe 40 or 50 videos up there that you can use in your lodge if you are so inclined, or you can invite me. If you see a video that you like, I can actually do it because they're not full presentations. I've got a lot more meat beyond what it is that I put on the YouTube channel. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you, my brothers. You've been listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.